Hello, friends of Powerhouse Bakery. I'm Suzanne Parker, and I'm the owner here at Powerhouse. And I'm a registered dietitian. I've been in practice for a long time. And I started out with a true passion for fitness and how do we really help people get their very best goals accomplished, meaning that nutrition has a really important role in that. And most of you know that at Powerhouse Bakery, we are dedicated gluten-free, but we're also dedicated to really teaching people what it means to eat a healthy diet. Over the last 20 years that I've been really focused on helping people in a consulting role, what I've learned is that people get very used to their favorite foods. They get very used to cultural influences that their family has steeped them in. And also big drivers of what people choose to have in their refrigerators and on their plates is truly based on how we view ourselves. Do we see ourselves as an athlete? Do we see ourselves in the affluence of the Western diet? Do we see ourselves maybe on a lower economic level? And all of those factors really influence what we choose to shop for, what we choose to feed our families, and truly where we kind of go with our nutrition knowledge and the emphasis that we put on nutrition. So today what I want to talk to you about is the Western diet and how that compares to the world diet. And of course, we're in the big topic of protein. And remember that we have 3 macronutrients to choose from. So anytime we eat, foods are going to fit into one of those 3 categories. So while we never can really separate out proteins completely from carbohydrates and fats, and we sure can't separate out proteins from fats because so often when they come from foods, they're almost always going to be paired up. An animal that has flesh that we're eating, so muscles, will have fat as part of the integrity of that food, and even plant-based proteins will almost always have proteins as a part of the composition, and that's really because it's the stuff of life. Oftentimes proteins can be used for energy if they're a special kind of branched chain amino acid, but for the most part, those foods that have protein in them are used for rebuilding of tissues and cells and organs, and helping to prompt our immune system. So as we look at the world as a whole and understand what has been feeding humans over the long haul, and what makes the Western diet different than maybe what the rest of the world is eating. So I wanted to start with a very interesting chart. I got this from a great resource, the World Resources Institute. And as probably most of you know, in the past several years, I've been really studying how our diet influences several things about our world economy, the health of our earth, but also the health of our people. And understanding when we get data from people over long periods of time, so a longitudinal study, it helps us understand some really powerful truths that maybe we miss when we're looking at short-term studies, or a study that is one study, or a very small population study. So whenever you're reading information and you hear one study says, or a group of 10 people show, your red flag should go up, and you want to think, gosh, that's a very small sample size, and is that really valid in making truths that we then want to make decisions on? So this information on this chart, I think, is really helpful in kind of propelling our discussion today on protein and how we view our intake of protein in overall health in the Western world and, of course, the rest of the world. So what we see here is people are eating more protein than they need, especially in wealthy regions. And we've heard that before, that the Western diet definitely has access to expensive food sources, which are animal-based. So what is showing us here on this side is the grams of protein consumed. And here, this black line is showing us the average daily protein requirement. And that's based on the experts in our industry. So the National Institute of Health and the USDA. So a lot of this data has been gathered over a long, long time. So we understand that there are some base facts that we want to build from. So what we're understanding here is that the average daily protein requirement we've given as 50 grams for an average person. Now granted, I'm not average as far as size, so it's only going to make sense for a small percentage of people when we're talking average. But let's just suffice to say that average is what we can work with. So when we look at this graph, the population is across, and of course now we've got these population types. So we have India, Asia, Africa, Latin America, former Soviet Union, China, and so on. Right up here with the US being at the very top, US and Canada. So what we're trying to glean from this really interesting chart is look how far above our protein intake is above what we have said is our daily requirement. And so much of that is because we have been sort of taught that protein is what the wealthy can afford and what the wealthy should eat more of. Because we have been taught that more is better. And the linguistics of this whole evolution of protein is really quite interesting, because the whole word protein is really evolved from it being a very special, a very unique macronutrient. And we've learned that if we have people that are malnourished, so in Africa and other third world countries, kwashiorkor is a very compelling and tragic malnourishment that happens especially to children. You might have seen pictures where their arms are very thin and they have a very bloated abdomen. So we learned from helping these third world countries that if we can give them more protein, they seem to do better. And we've learned that if we give them more protein, they can grow faster, grow taller, and are overall more robust. Maybe even smarter, which we're not 100% sure if that's related to protein or not. But when we understand that the USDA and the NIH have told us that protein is important because it avoids malnutrition and it even helps us do better, growing bigger and taller and more robust. Now look, interestingly, as we go through this graph, we see that even Asia has more, slightly more, than what we have said is enough. And we've learned that Asia and the Asian culture is evolving, even like the Western diet culture, meaning that when they step away from their culture of eating a very small amount above normal and when they move to the US and they become more westernized, they start eating even more protein. And we see that with the increase in protein, we start to see more diseases. So even though the NIH and the USDA have told us that the average person needs around 50 grams of protein, we've been taught that more is better. So if you can afford it, you better eat it. More is better. With the increase in protein around the world, we see that we have increased disease. We have typically the increase in disease is related to a metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is a group of conditions that really drive a lot of our chronic conditions. So if I say the metabolic syndrome, what it really entails is overweight. So anything that is above your ideal body weight. So again, that's a criteria that the NIH has established for us. We'll just say obesity. And with the metabolic syndrome, we also get hypertension, and we start seeing all kinds of cardiovascular disease. So when we start seeing an increase in total calories, protein as well, we start seeing overweightness happen, and then we see hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. all of these are related to increased calorie intake. So when we look at the world versus the Western diet, more is better, and it's all driven by protein. We see that our overall calorie intake becomes very skewed, and we increase all of our intake, primarily the protein that drives it, and then we start seeing all kinds of disease states. So when we look at the Asian cultures and some of the other cultures that eat very close to that ideal, we actually see less diseases happening. And one that's really, I think, pertinent to all of us is whenever we see an increase in diseases, we also see an increase in one of the scariest ones, and that is cancer. And so here's an interesting phenomenon. We know that as we study protein intake, and we understand that when we have a deficiency and we provide extra protein, we see an increase in growth speed and size. The question then becomes, increasing protein that leads to increased growth isn't always the ideal. So increased protein as a world goal, increased growth isn't always the best, because we know that when dietary protein goes up, we also see growth of even the bad cells. So keep with me on this. So we know that increase in protein carries with it an increase in total calorie intake, which has shown us that the Western diet has a lot higher incidence of metabolic syndrome, so diabetes and heart disease, because of what happens with our overall weight increase. So we also see that we have an increase in bad growth cells. So the cancer cells are being fed a lot of nutrients. So when an increase in protein happens around the world, we start to see an increase in cancer around the world. And that's what I think is the most scary for us all. When we break down those other diseases, so cardiovascular disease, and of course diabetes, we also see an increase in the bad cells. We see an increase in the cholesterol carrying cells in the arteries, because it can't manage all of those extra calories. And we know that whenever there's an increase in protein, we almost always see an increase in fat, because remember, the animal fat is carried with fat, so protein and fat go together. And so it's very hard to separate out those macronutrients. And as the wealthy Western diet increases their protein, they're almost always going to have the accoutrements that go with protein, which means that all of those macronutrients go up as well, which leads to weight gain. And so we know that this cascade of events does seem to cause an increase in the bad cell growth, which is cancer. Now, let's also look at another component of this. The smaller, we'll call it poorer nations, tend to, of course, be more active, which we can never discount the value of an active lifestyle. So we know that piece has to be included in our discussion, but we also know that when you take out animal protein, what's left? So we know that the wealthy nations eat more animal protein because we can afford it. When you take out animal protein, you start to increase your amount of plant-based foods. Now, the good part about what happens with this is when you increase plant-based foods, you by default get lower fat intake, you get higher nutrient intake, so more vitamins, minerals, fiber, and water. So when we look at populations as a whole, when they eat less animal protein, they by default get more plant-based protein. So when we looked at that chart, we saw that even the Asian countries that only ate a little bit over our standard 50 gram of protein, we know that with that, whenever they ate more protein, their diseases also rose. We also know that when they decreased animal protein, their incidence of cancers also fell. Some of this study is, as you know, by it's in the China study, the research that's very provocative, that is really been looked at for a 20-year longitudinal research. And it looked at some very specific types of proteins, but in general, what I want us to do is take away the idea that disease increase is really correlated with overall calorie intake, especially when it's compared to a level of activity. And then the second part is when your protein from animals declines, so does your incidence of disease. Because we know that aging is a normal part of life, but to help to minimize the progression of the poorly, of the bad cells, we definitely need to have more of the micronutrients. A little bit more of those phytochemicals. And again, those are from the plant-based nutrition. So as we go through some more of those countries, we'll really start to understand what happens with some of this science that is starting to extrapolate what becomes our best diet. So remember, all of my conversations are really helping you to decide what is your best foods list. So what is the takeaway? We want to understand that from the Western world, we've learned a lot. The Western diet style has been really prompted by marketing and by celebrities that tell us that they have the answers to longevity and anti-aging, and you just need to buy their supplement or eat their special diet. And quite often it's based only on a tiny bit of science. And so what I really implore you to do is, when you look at science, understand what data they're using in their science process. Are they looking at a very large population study? When we look at people groups, we're learning a lot. It's always nice to kind of have hindsight, to be able to look back and go, what did this body of evidence tell us? And how are we able to really glean information that's valuable to us today based on that information? So when we look at your best foods list, we want to make sure that we do get some protein-rich foods. We want to make sure that we get carbohydrate foods. And of course, we want good fats. And we know that protein foods that come from animals are definitely a great source of amino acids. We've heard that it's the most efficient way to get amino acids. And that word is a little bit ambiguous, efficient. What does that mean? Well, it means that the amino acids that come from the muscle cell of the chicken are a little bit easier for the body to put right into our bloodstream and get used again for rebuilding our own muscle. But that's not to say that it doesn't come with some risk factors. And that, of course, is how we look at how that chicken is raised and what kind of diet did that chicken have, and what other chemicals are coming along with that animal. And that's why it becomes so provocative to think about how we raise our wild, our livestock versus how they're raised in the wild. So the way the animal is raised will have some impact on the quality of the protein that we get from that animal. We also know that in carbohydrate foods that we typically think of as carbohydrates certainly do have amino acids present. Not to say there aren't risks also of how we get our amino acids from those plants. Again, how we treat our planet, or those plants, has a big impact on how well we can get our nutrient quality from those plants. And so I think in the future, we've got a really exciting process of learning how to get our best foods, especially proteins, to help build and rebuild and cultivate our best foods menu planning. And I think in short, what we want to suggest is that getting some amino acids from plant-based foods as well as animal foods is definitely going to be the way to go. So let's look again at this overall diagram, and we really can get a good idea of what's happening as a trend. We know that the Western culture emphasizes more protein. The more plant-based cultures are certainly eating enough protein, but maybe not as much extra as we are in a Western diet. Again, the USDA is giving us guidelines. And so this 50-gram guideline, what I want you to see is what does that look like as far as food types. 50 grams of protein in a given day. And if we think of the Western diet being in excess, what would it look like to have just the right amount? So a 50-gram protein diet. Here's a little bit of science to play with. We know that protein foods in every ounce of chicken breast gives us 7 grams protein. So if we needed to get 50 grams of protein in a day, we could do 7 times 5 ounces would give us 35 grams of protein. We're getting close. If we wanted to go a little bit more and say, okay, 7 ounces of protein, 7 times 7, 49 grams. Wow, there we go, easy. 7 ounces of protein in the day, what would that look like? Or 7 grams of protein in the day in order to meet that requirement if you're an average size male. So again, we're going a little bit higher than probably what I would need. And so when we think of 7 ounces of chicken breast, and of course I'm not singling out the chicken, but oftentimes people think of chicken breast as being the easiest to obtain and cook and prepare. 7 ounces of chicken, we could also break that down into 1 egg. So in the morning, you'll get some protein. And in the evening, maybe that's your traditional time where you get a heftier serving of maybe, let's say, ground turkey. And then at lunch, hopefully you're getting a nice big salad. And so on that salad, maybe you'll put 2 ounces of tuna. So this is a typical eating style to get your 7 ounces of protein that you need. So there's 4, 5, 6, 7 ounces of protein. But that's not the only places that we get our protein, because most likely you're going to eat something with that egg. So let's say we're going to have it with a piece of toast, which has 2 more grams of protein because it's a plant-based. And say with that tuna, you're going to have maybe a nice big salad, and you're going to have maybe a 1/4 cup of beans for your complex carbohydrates, and maybe you're going to have some extra veggies on there, like maybe some broccoli and carrots. So we know that the salad, the beans, and the veggies are going to give you at least 5, probably more, grams extra of protein. And then for dinner, adding to your ground turkey, maybe we're going to have 1 cup of pasta noodles, and best case scenario, it would be something that would give you lots of whole grains. So that's going to give you no less than 5 grams more protein. And you're going to have something on the side. We know that we don't just eat a plate of pasta with meat sauce, right? We're going to also have maybe 1 cup of spinach, and maybe you would even have some garlic bread. So what I'm trying to show you is how easily our protein levels go way higher than what we needed, even on what we would think of as a healthy diet. Garlic bread, maybe we're using some healthy whole grain bread, so at least it's going to give us 3 more grams of protein. Our cup of spinach has at least 2 grams of protein. And so the nice thing is it's not hard at all to get your minimum requirements of 50 grams of protein. So even on a poor man's diet in the Western culture, you can easily get more than enough. And so my suggestion to you is every once in a while, pick a day where you get all plant-based for lunch. So maybe it's just plants only. That way, you're increasing your micronutrients and you're not even getting close to going below your protein requirements for the day. And so we've learned a lot by comparing the Western culture with other cultures, because we see that protein is absolutely over consumed in the Western culture, which sadly leads to potential diseases, all of which we want to try to avoid. And with our wealth, we want to really utilize a wealth of knowledge and learn how to decipher what would be the most valuable foods to put on your best foods list to get the best of both worlds, both the micronutrients from plants as well as seeds and nuts, and also be able to enjoy some of the wonderful things of the Western diet culture, which is enjoying some animal protein here and there, because certainly we can have a wonderful celebration meal and include lots of well cooked foods to be part of your best foods list. So I hope this has helped you a little bit to understand where your protein should come from and how learning from other parts of the world can really help us be wiser with our food choices. So thanks so much for joining me. See you soon.